as like an evidence control officer, so there isn't the bias between the two, to make it more just. They also need to make sure that the analysts in the labs are certified, and there's certain training that they all need to go through, because as Lee had mentioned with the interns and a lot of turnover in the labs, that creates bias, that creates problems with procedures, and I mean, every time you bring somebody new into the lab, you need to take the time to train them, and it causes many problems, and there could be inadequate training, which could then lead to problems and wrongful conviction.
What kind of standards do you feel should be set to minimize these problems?
As I mentioned, training programs are huge to make sure everybody is on task doing what they're supposed to do, and it's important that they know how to do it. Especially with maybe some of the interns, if they do receive training, they could, you know, maybe run into a problem, but since they're so busy and the high caseloads, might kind of overlook a part of it and just go like an instinct instead of what should be done. Protocols for documenting forensic tests, examinations, and analyses, and for archiving reports, bench notes, other important documentation. A licensing program for all laboratories that are offering the lab tests, exams, or analysis by the state. And there needs to be internal structures and protocols to regulate the flow of information between the examiner and the person requesting the forensic services to minimize the inadvertent bias and the processing and interpretation of evidence and testimony.
What has the government done, like on a federal level?
The first act we'll look at is the Justice for All Act of 2004. It directly addresses the need for forensic oversight, instructing the U.S. Attorney General to create and appoint members to a federal forensic science commission, requiring federal laboratories to undergo frequent audits and expand the requirements for the Paul Coverdell Forensic Science Improvement Federal Grant Program. And while the standards for forensic laboratories presented in the Act only apply to, like, at a federal level, it was kind of like an incentive for, like, state and local crime labs to follow this model. And they looked at protecting the crime victims' rights and eliminating the substantial backlog of DNA samples collected from crime scenes and convicted of offenders. This would be a great model for states because of the increase in felony cases that they're getting, or the increase of cases that they're getting in general, and because of the lack of staffing. It also was to improve and expand the DNA testing capacity of federal, state, and local crime laboratories, increase research and development of new DNA testing technologies. We talked about a couple of them today. There's many more that they have to use in the crime labs, and develop new training programs regarding the collection and use of DNA evidence to minimize the incorrect processing of it. Congress also recognized the importance of adequate funding for forensic science in 2000, and this was the Paul Coverdell National Forensic Science Improvement Act that I mentioned. This was so the states could follow the federal government's lead to deal with the backlogs of forensic material, increase the pay of qualified analysts, and improving training, and create and enforce meaningful lab standards and oversight. So if they receive more funding, they won't have as much turnover in the lab because they're not doing, twice the amount of work for a minimal amount of pay. So there's more incentive there for them to not have so much turnover in the laboratories.
What can the states do themselves to help with this?
States need to create independent labs that don't deal with the law enforcement, that don't have, direct connection with the prosecutorial agencies. They need to create a position designed to manage the flow of information between the two groups, such as like an evidence control officer. And this person in this position could filter out irrelevant information and provide analysts with only the information that is needed. And this will also help eliminate bias in the laboratory. In most states, police agencies or other public safety agencies have jurisdiction over the operation of public forensic labs. Analysts sometimes see the role, as I mentioned before, as like the crime fighting instead of having like an objective agent of science, which leads them to get the job done, find out who did it, whether it is right or not, and get that person locked up, to think that they're, making, America a better place by locking up the criminal, even if he or she is not the actual criminal. They also need to make forensic science labs structurally independent, as I mentioned, to guarantee an environment that's objective. So.
Do you have any examples of what different states have done for this?
I actually do. There's a handful of states that are leading the way in making the labs independent from law enforcement and the prosecutorial agencies. Arkansas is one. They created a state crime lab that operates independent. Virginia also has an independent Department of Forensic Science. Maryland, in 2007, they created an independent system for oversight, and theirs is called the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. This legislation directs the DHMH to create a quality assurance program, retain all case files for 10 years in case, you have to go back and look at anything, establish qualifications for personnel or for forensic labs, establish procedures for verifying the background education of the personnel. This will possibly wean out some of the interns that have less experience or have them work under somebody that's already in the lab instead of having them take over, certain jobs. New York is another example. In 1994, they created an oversight board to regulate the labs at a state level. They have minimum standards for accreditation. They investigate cases of negligence or misconduct, and they also revoke accreditations if need be. So that also helps. Texas, as we talked about before, they also passed legislation in 2003 requiring that evidence come from labs accredited by the Department of Public Safety in order to be admissible at trial. And they passed legislation in 2005 creating a Forensic Science Commission. The Commission's main responsibilities are to identify the problem, recommend corrective action, demand effective implementation.
So does poor forensic evidence show up in those courtrooms?
It definitely does, and that is part of the reason why we do have so many convictions that are, eventually overturned after these quote-unquote criminals have spent, 10, 12, 15 years in jail or in prison, and they don't have the chance of spending, time with their families. The attorneys and judges have not been successful in their attempts to prevent the introduction of bad forensic evidence in the courtroom, and the courts often admit forensic evidence with little scrutiny of its reliability. They kind of assume that because it's coming from a forensic lab, which is supposed to be, accredited, and procedures followed to make sure that it's adequate and correct, they have many problems with kind of filtering out what's good evidence and what's not good evidence. The judges and attorneys also simply don't have the scientific background or education. So that's why there needs to also be some implementation of policies to kind of help the judges and attorneys, filter out what's good evidence, what's bad evidence, and also the juries. Many jurors assume that because it's, scientific, it's, was done in the lab, that it's automatically correct, which is not always the case. And we have, as we talked about with Texas being, they have a high rate of exoneration.
We have one of the highest crime rates in the nation. We're one of the most violent